80 AD. The Roman Colosseum. The sun burns down on white marble, heat shimmering above the sand. 50,000 voices thunder and collide, rising into a single hungry roar. In the center stands a woman, naked, trembling, chained upright to a wooden frame. She is not a fighter. She is not a criminal. But her fate has already been decided. A bull is released into the arena, snorting, hooves tearing at the sand. But the animal isn't there to gore her or kill her. The horror is slow, deliberate, a display. The guards bring out a life-sized mechanical cow made of wood and leather. They pry open its shell. They force the woman inside. The crowd surges forward in excitement. Senators lean in, children cheer, and the bull is guided toward the replica, driven into a frenzy. The poet Martial was present at the Colosseum's inaugural festival and recorded it plainly. "We saw Pasiphaë united with the bull. The ancient legend was enacted under Caesar's eye." Rome, the empire of engineers, philosophers, roads, law, and public ritualized sexual torture presented as entertainment. Welcome to the Roman arena. Today, we are going to uncover the most brutal, most obscene, most carefully orchestrated spectacles ever staged under Rome's banner. Not fantasy, not exaggeration, intentionally crafted, legally sanctioned. These were events designed not just to shock, but to shape Roman identity, obedience, and loyalty. Because none of this was chaos, this was politics. Here, we don't rewrite history to make it comfortable. We expose what humanity did when it believed itself invincible. If dark history stories leave you wanting answers that textbooks never gave, hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps unlock more hidden chapters of the past. If you've only ever heard of gladiators as noble warriors fighting fairly in the sand, you've only heard the sanitized version, the one designed to make the empire look glorious. But the reality? The arena was a machine that ran on blood. Rome, 1st through 4th century AD. At its height, the empire ruled over 60 million people, stretching across continents. And in that vast world, nearly every major city shared one architectural symbol: an amphitheater. Over 250 of them across imperial territory. The Colosseum alone could seat as many as 50,000 spectators, and it was filled almost daily. This was not occasional entertainment. This was a cultural institution. The historian Eutropius estimated that across 4 centuries, over 400,000 people died in Roman arenas, entire populations erased, not by disease, famine, or warfare, but for sport. During the Colosseum's grand opening, Emperor Titus hosted 100 consecutive days of games. On those sands, 9,000 animals were slaughtered. That's 90 deliberate killings per day, performed for applause. After Emperor Trajan conquered the Dacians, he held a festival lasting 123 days. 10,000 gladiators forced to fight, thousands of prisoners executed. This was death at an administrative scale, scheduled, budgeted, supplied. The philosopher Seneca attended the midday executions and came away shaken, not by what he saw, but by how much he enjoyed them. He wrote, "I come home more greedy, more cruel, more inhumane, because I have been among humans." That was the point. The arena taught obedience through joy. When you cheer as someone dies, you become complicit. And when a population is complicit, it does not rebel. This is why Rome spent more on arena entertainment than on public education, healthcare, or infrastructure. Cassius Dio noted that the empire poured unfathomable wealth into capturing animals from Africa and the Near East, transporting criminals and war captives across continents, maintaining gladiator schools, and constructing elaborate killing stages. Rome built a logistical industry to produce daily, public death.
It all began in 264 BC. 3 Roman sons organized funeral rites for their father. But instead of prayers or offerings, they chose blood. They forced enslaved men to fight to the death. At that time, the fight took place in a cattle market, filthy, crowded, reeking of dung. The Romans called this event munas, a duty owed to the deceased. The bloodshed was meant to appease the dead spirit, so it would rest. But the wealthy and powerful saw something else in it: influence, prestige, display. A funeral with simple sacrifice showed respect. A funeral with men dying in front of thousands showed dominance. By the 3rd century BC, political families were using funeral games as campaign strategy. Show the crowd enough blood, and the crowd would remember your name when election day arrived. The armor worn by early gladiators was symbolic. The Samnite gladiator fought in the armor of Rome's conquered Samnite enemies. Every blow reenacted conquest. Every death reminded the people: Rome triumphs, Rome rules, Rome kills those who stand against it. Temporary wooden stands soon proved insufficient, so Rome built temples to violence. The first great amphitheaters rose from stone, massive, permanent public monuments where death spoke the same message every time. Rome commands not only men, not only nations, but life and death itself. Once bloodshed became expected, Rome escalated. Ordinary deaths no longer impressed the crowds. The empire discovered something powerful. Exotic suffering was more exciting than familiar suffering. So the hunt began, not for gladiators, but for animals. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, bears from the German forests, crocodiles from the Nile, even giraffes dragged across deserts. These were called venationes, animal spectacles. But they were not hunts, they were executions of nature. In 46 BC, Julius Caesar introduced the first giraffe ever seen in Europe. The Romans had no word for it, so they called it a camel leopard. They marveled at it for a moment. Then they slaughtered it. At the Colosseum's inauguration, more than 9,000 animals died. Archaeological evidence shows many were intentionally starved so they would die faster and more dramatically. Behind the scenes, the logistics were appalling. Caravans dragged cages for thousands of miles. Entire hunting expeditions died capturing beasts. Fleets transported animals upriver in cramped crates. Handlers risked being mauled before the animals ever reached Rome. The Colosseum wasn't just a theater of death. It was an ecological catastrophe, pushing entire species toward extinction. And the crowds loved it. Animal spectacles thrilled the crowds, but they were only the beginning. Rome learned quickly that excitement wasn't found in fairness. The audience didn't want balanced contests, heroic duels, or honorable combat. They wanted suffering they could anticipate, but still feel suspense in watching. And so, the gladiator games evolved into something far more calculated. When we imagine gladiators, we picture noble warriors of equal skill, locked in dramatic battle. The truth was different. Rome loved imbalance. The crowds wanted to see fear, desperation, the slow disintegration of hope. Prisoners, slaves, Deserters, people with no training, were thrown into the arena wearing cheap costumes or comedic clown-like armor. They were given wooden swords. Sometimes, they were given nothing at all. Their job wasn't to fight. Their job was to die entertainingly. Against them stood trained gladiators, men honed in special schools, conditioned to kill quickly, precisely, and with flair. These weren't sportsmen. They were weapons. Their blows were decisive, their movements practiced, their victories inevitable. The audience knew who would die. That was the entertainment. Even the gladiator classes were engineered to produce spectacle. The ritualized, carrying nothing but a net and a trident, fought the secutor, whose helmet was shaped specifically to deflect that net. The fight was not about power. It was about suspense. Would the ritualized entangle his opponent, or would the secutor corner him and finish the fight? Other matches were even crueler. One gladiator might face multiple opponents, or a heavily armored fighter might face one who was nearly naked and exposed. Some helmets limited vision so severely that fighters stumbled blindly while the audience laughed. Armor was not protection. It was restriction, a tool of humiliation. Gladiators were often costumed to resemble Rome's defeated enemies, Thracians, Samnites, Gauls. Their staged deaths reenacted Roman conquest endlessly. Even in entertainment, Rome reminded the world that it had conquered everything. But as brutal as gladiator combat was, it was not the worst spectacle Rome offered. Because at midday, when the sun was at its peak, the tone of the arena shifted. The morning belonged to sport, but noon belonged to death. At this hour, crowds filed out, only to grab snacks, wine, bread. They came back to watch a different kind of performance entirely. Condemnation to the beasts.
Criminals, prisoners of war, enslaved people, rebels, anyone Rome wanted erased were brought out and displayed as living warnings. This was not a fight, it was a message. Victims were tied to wooden posts, stripped naked, covered in blood or bait, and left defenseless. Then, the animals were released. Lions starved for weeks, bears tortured in pits so they entered enraged, leopards trained to strike at movement. The crowd bet on one thing: how long the victim would scream. During Emperor Trajan's celebration after conquering Dacia, thousands of captives were executed this way over 123 days. The historian Strabo recorded victims tied to stakes while trained bulls gored them slowly, repeatedly, until they collapsed. This was framed as justice, but it was entertainment, and everyone watching knew it. Then came the darkest transformation of all. The condemned stopped simply dying. They were forced to act out their deaths. Rome turned execution into theater. The audience watched stories they knew, Greek tragedies, Roman myths, played by real people who suffered the fate the characters suffered. But this time, the suffering was real. The musician Orpheus, in myth, charms beasts with his music. In the arena, a performer dressed as Orpheus played his lyre while animals circled. But instead of being enchanted, a bear tore him apart in full view of the laughing crowd. Martial wrote of this, "If he had delayed, the beasts might have obeyed." A cruel joke. Another victim played Daedalus, father of Icarus. They strapped crude wings to his arms and hoisted him into the air. For a moment, he soared. Then they dropped him into a pit of waiting beasts below. The poet Martial said dryly, "The man must have wished for real feathers." But the most infamous myth acted in the arena was the one we began with. Pasiphaë and the bull. A woman forced into a wooden cow. A bull forced to mate with it. The execution that turned death into humiliation. Violence into erotic spectacle. The human body into a prop. Tertullian wrote that women sentenced to die were sometimes raped first in front of the crowd to make the humiliation complete. This wasn't justice. This was ownership. Rome owned its myths. Rome owned the stage. Rome owned human lives.
But still, Rome wasn't finished. The empire asked itself a new question. What if we brought the ocean into the city? And so came the Naumachii, mock naval battles fought on real water. Julius Caesar dug a basin near the Tiber River and filled it. He forced thousands of prisoners to board warships and fight to the death. Arrows, ramming, drowning, blood on the water. But the scale only grew. In 2 BC, Emperor Augustus constructed a basin almost 2,000 by 1,200 feet, fed by its own aqueduct just to fill it. 30 warships battled in front of tens of thousands of spectators. No one on the ships was meant to survive. By the time of Emperor Claudius, Rome drained a lake for the spectacle. Prisoners saluted him with the words, "Morituri te salutant." Those who are about to die salute you. One of the most haunting lines in history, spoken by men who knew they had no chance. Even the Colosseum could be flooded and drained. One day, naval battle. The next day, gladiators. The next, executions. Engineering, cruelty, and spectacle fused into one machine. And then Rome crossed the final line. Women were forced to fight gladiators. Not mock fights, real ones. Sometimes they fought naked, sometimes against dwarfs, sometimes against animals. Satirists mocked them, but the records are clear. They bled and died in the sand. Other punishments turned humans into light sources. Victims were soaked in pitch, tied to stakes, and set on fire.
Tertullian called them living torches. Crowds watched. Children played. Vendors sold wine. And crucifixion? Borrowed from the East, perfected by Rome, displayed publicly in the arena as a form of lunch-hour entertainment. Not quick deaths, days-long agony, bodies contorted against their own weight, slowly asphyxiating. Then there was Commodus, the emperor who believed himself a god and who fought as a gladiator. But his fights were staged. His opponents were weakened. His animals were hobbled. His victories were forced. Applause was mandatory. Cassius Dio wrote that Commodus fought 735 times, each victory costing the treasury a fortune. A spectacle of power, not courage. By the late Empire, more money was spent on games than on the army. Citizens demanded bread and spectacle instead of discipline. Violence stripped Rome of humanity. Seneca admitted, "I come home more cruel, more inhumane, because I have been among humans." Tertullian condemned the arena as seeds of cruelty. Juvenal mocked Rome's people as a population who wanted only bread and circuses, cheap food and endless entertainment. The appetite for brutality hollowed the empire from inside. By the 5th century, the Colosseum fell silent. The sands cooled. The crowds dispersed. The echoes faded. What remained was the warning. A society that celebrates cruelty eventually becomes defined by it, and then it falls.